This presentation is the first substantive post in a series in which I will be attempting to apply the theory of morality that I've defended elsewhere in this channel to current events. On February 24, 2022, Russian leader Vladimir Putin ordered the Russian military to invade Ukraine. And I want to know what the theory that I've been defending would say about that act. Because this is the first application video, I need to say something about the theory and how it can be applied. I'll start with a general description of what it takes for an action to be wrong or immoral, and that is, for an act to be wrong, it must be the case that people generally have reasons to give everybody reasons to not perform acts of that type. So let's take drunk driving, for example. Drunk driving is wrong in virtue of the fact that people generally have reasons to give everybody reasons not to drive while drunk. So the question becomes, did Putin perform an act of a type where people generally have reasons to give everybody reasons not to perform actions of that type? And I will argue that he did. Military invasions, like drunk driving, tend to be somewhat destructive of lives, health, property, and the well-being of several individuals. Since people have reasons to avoid these harms, people have reasons to give other people reasons not to engage in or support violent acts of aggression, such as Putin's aggression against Ukraine. Compared to the wrongness of drunk driving, what Putin did was orders of magnitude worse. To provide some more detail to the theory, I wish to say something about what it means to give people reasons not to perform actions of a certain type. There are two types of reasons. We can give people external reasons not to perform actions of a particular type. In the case of drunk driving, external reasons include fines, suspending a license, or time in jail. When it comes to launching an invasion of another country, external reasons not to do this include economic sanctions, social and political sanctions, such as banning citizens of the offending country from participating in international cultural and sporting events, by the destruction of military equipment and infrastructure used in the conflict. I provide these as examples of external reasons. Whether they should be applied in a given case is subject to further debate. For example, I tend not to favor cultural sanctions. Arguments can also be made against harms to civilians. The people who warrant the sanctions are those who can directly respond to them. In order to prevent people from performing acts of a particular type, we can also create internal reasons. Most of us refrain from stealing or harming others not because we fear punishment, but because we're not that kind of person. An international culture of non-aggression can be expected to be far more effective at avoiding war than merely hoping for the effects of external sanctions. One important point to note is that when giving people reasons, we can only efficiently give them reasons not to perform acts of a particular type. We have reasons to give everybody reasons not to perform acts of the type drunk driving. We have reasons to give everybody reasons not to perform acts of the type breaking promises. And we have reasons, lots and lots of reasons, to give everybody reasons not to perform or support acts of the type military aggression. This then is the moral principle that I'll be applying to Putin's actions. But we have to ask, is it the case that we have reasons to give everybody reasons not to perform or support acts of military aggression? To answer this question, I'm going to be focusing on the history of Western Europe. From the time of the ancient Greeks until 1945, wars of aggression were common, practically everyday affairs. A substantial portion of the population would die violently or suffer injuries from participating in violent conflict. Or they would suffer other effects of violent conflict, such as disease, famine, rape, slavery. Of course, people living in those times had reasons to give everybody reasons not to cause or support such conflict. However, the culture at the time gave people reasons to participate in violent conflict. There were the rewards that went to the victors, and there were the rewards that went in the form of honor and prestige that could best be earned by participating in war. So the history of Europe was a history of war until World War I. The brutality of that war gave rise to the hopeful slogan, "The war to end all wars." That war made clear that there were reasons against having a culture of war. It boosted the motivation to find some way to prevent such things from happening in the future. As any student of history will tell you, This didn't stick. In 1931, the Japanese military took over Manchuria and established a puppet state. The League of Nations didn't impose any sanctions or create any external reasons for Japan to reverse this policy. It did vote 42-1, with Japan being the one, against Japan's aggression. But then Japan withdrew from the League of Nations in 1933 and in 1937 invaded the rest of China. Italy invaded Abyssinia in 1935. The League of Nations attempted to create external reasons for Italy to end this invasion and go back to its borders. It passed sanctions. But like Japan, Italy left the League of Nations and continued its war of aggression. The next major European aggression was when Germany and Russia attacked Poland in September of 1939 and divided the country between them. This was the official start of World War II. One should mention that while Germany was taking Poland and making plans against France, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway, Russia started a war of aggression against Finland. By the time World War II ended, people were thinking that there was a need to take this idea to create reasons not to start or support wars of aggression seriously. This time they created the United Nations, and they made wars of aggression a violation of international law. They put this system to the test in the form of a United Nations response to North Korea's aggression against South Korea in 1950s. Then we entered a period from 1945 until 2022 when there were no major wars of aggression in Europe. There were conflicts. Violent military deaths didn't end, but they were vanishingly few compared to the previous 3,000 years, until Putin invaded Ukraine. So are there reasons to give everybody reasons not to initiate or support wars of aggression? A comparison of Western Europe from the early Greeks until 1945, and comparing that to Europe from 1945 until 1922, suggests that there are, in fact, lots and lots of reasons. The next major point to bring out is that there are no absolute moral principles. The claim that some type of action is wrong identifies what philosophers call a pro tanto wrong, or sometimes a prima facie wrong. The reasons not to perform acts of a particular type can, in certain circumstances, be outweighed by stronger reasons to perform that action. For example, people have reasons to give everybody reasons to keep their promises. But these reasons to keep one's promises should never be so strong that a person whose child is badly injured and needs to get to the hospital, for instance, will sacrifice the child in order to keep the promise. People generally have reasons to create even stronger reasons to care for one's child than to keep one's promises. So we're going to have to ask, are there concerns that would outweigh the reasons not to invade another country? Well, I'd be willing to argue that our concern not to invade other countries can be outweighed by an even stronger concern to prevent a Holocaust. That is to say, if the government of a country was rounding up and slaughtering whole populations, the obligation to protect innocent lives may outweigh the obligation not to invade other countries. The wrongness of invading other countries still exists, just like the wrongness of breaking a promise still exists, but it can be outweighed. As it turns out, Putin is using this as a defense of his invasion of Ukraine, claiming to be interfering with the genocide of native Russians living in Ukraine. However, the accusation is a lie. Not only is there no evidence of such a genocide, there's no evidence that could be mistaken as evidence for such a genocide. It's all pure fabrication. I don't think I need to start a discussion of the wrongness of lying to make a wrongdoing appear legitimate. Another lie is that the invasion is needed to prevent the Nazification of Ukraine. The leader of Ukraine is a Jew, elected by the population, with other Jews and minorities in positions of power. Again, not only is there no evidence of the Nazification of Ukraine, there's no evidence that can be mistaken for evidence. This denazification claim doesn't come from nothing. Russia remembers World War II and its archenemy, the Nazis. Putin seeks to exploit this memory by branding those he seeks to attack as Nazis. Consistent with this, Putin identifies the United States and Western Europe as being under the influence of Nazis, still seeking to bring about the destruction of Russia. This means that for Russia, Ukraine can either be pro-Russia or pro-Nazi. These are the only options. Now note the similarities between this propaganda tactic and Hitler's defense of his actions as being directed against a global Jewish conspiracy to destroy Germany. A third lie is that Russia is attempting to control bioweapons labs that are found in Ukraine. Now, lies are best built on a foundation of truth. The truth in this case is that when the former Soviet Union fell apart, there were many biological and nuclear weapons and weapons facilities left in Ukraine. To prevent these weapons of mass destruction from ending up in the hands of terrorists, the United States worked to close down these former Soviet Union facilities, and did so with Russian cooperation. This bioweapons fiction unfortunately gets some traction because it's the same excuse the United States used for its invasion of Iraq. The susceptibility of a moral principle to violation based on lies, misinformation, motivated beliefs, and the like argue for systems being in place that make sure that one's information is correct before acting on it. This should not obscure the fact that there is no evidence of such labs in Ukraine, let alone evidence that supports an intent to use such weapons that would be needed to justify an invasion. One point to make about these fictions is that if Putin had a good argument for invading Ukraine, there would be no need to rely on these fictions and misrepresentations. It's certainly possible that somebody can perform a legitimate action and still lie about it because they're afraid of the consequences of the truth or if they're embarrassed. However, in this type of situation, the lie is still a lie, and if one wants to argue for the legitimacy of the action, one needs to reveal the truth, assuming that it exists. The case of a bioweapons fiction brings up another argument that Putin uses in defense of his invasion, that the United States is guilty of the same crime. But this isn't a defense against wrongdoing. One can't argue, I heard a news report about a rape, and as a result, I'm now justified in committing a rape. I hold that the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 was also immoral. It provides evidence that both internal and external reasons not to engage in this type of behavior needs to be strengthened. However, one person's or one country's immoral action does not free the rest of the world to do the same thing. One type of response that we should take pains to avoid has come to be called whataboutism. This is a popular attempt to change the subject by asking, what about this and what about that? Using this tactic, we avoid talking about Putin's wrongdoing and instead talk about somebody else's alleged wrongdoing, effectively letting Putin off the moral hook. But we should resist the temptation to change the subject. Putin's favorite justification for the invasion seems to be that it's not an invasion at all, because Ukraine is inherently and naturally a part of Russia. On this account, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has the same moral status as the Union Army's invasion of Virginia in 1861 to 1865. The target of the invasion had no right to leave, and it's legitimate to invade in order to prevent secession. This argument explains China's support for Russia in this conflict, since China will want to use this argument if it should try to reintegrate Taiwan into the nation of China. And Ukraine itself uses this argument to prevent the secession of the eastern provinces of Ukraine. This gets complicated since there's no natural law dictating the point at which one people may dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station, as it states in the U.S. Declaration of Independence. There are a number of points favoring Ukrainian sovereignty. On the breakup of the former Soviet Union, Ukraine was one of several independent nations that came into existence. Whatever status is given to one should be given to all on the principle that like cases should be treated alike. The status that makes the most sense is the status of independent sovereignty. Furthermore, in a national referendum on the subject in 1991, 92.3% of the population voted in favor of independent sovereignty. And finally, Russia was one of the signers of the Budapest Memorandum in 1994 that stated that none of the countries would use force against Ukraine. In this agreement, Ukraine was to give up its Soviet nuclear weapons acquired when it was a part of the Soviet Union, in exchange for assurances as to its national sovereignty so that it wouldn't have a need for these weapons. This is the same agreement that established the biomedical centers for getting rid of the biological weapons. This was the beginning of over 20 years of Russia treating Ukraine as a sovereign nation. In effect, this isn't analogous to the Union attacking Virginia in 1861. If we want a proper analogy, imagine the U.S. government negotiating the secession of 11 southern states into their own independent countries. Further, imagine that what was left of the United States negotiated with Virginia over the disposition of the Armory at Harper's Ferry, Fort Monroe, and the Norfolk Navy Yard. It negotiated treaties involving the use of the Potomac River and Chesapeake Bay. These treaties included promises not to use force against Virginia. Then in 1891, 30 years later, what was left of the United States decides to invade Virginia, and only Virginia. Though the line determining when a people have a right to form an independent state is vague, it's not that vague. Finally, another often mentioned proposed justification for the invasion was Russia's concern with NATO expansion. We could enter into a discussion over whether this was a legitimate concern or another fiction. However, since we're looking at moral principles here, we can set that question aside in favor of another principle. A sovereign state has a sovereign right to negotiate with whomever it pleases. Here, let's look at the following analogy. Imagine a college student who wants a relationship with another college student and who gets jealous because the object of his affections is going out with somebody that student doesn't like. So the student decides to put an end to that relationship by murdering the object of his attention. War is violence, and I don't like who your friends are is not a justification for violence. Given the way Putin was acting, is it really hard to understand why Ukraine might have been looking elsewhere for friends? So what Putin commanded was wrong. Saying that it was wrong means that people generally, including you and me, would be well advised to create reasons, both internal and external reasons, for not performing acts of this type. We, our friends and family, our neighbors, just about everybody, including and in particular our children and generations not yet born, would be better off if we were to create a culture filled with internal and external reasons not to start or support wars of aggression. So, in summary, the applicable moral principle is that it is wrong to start or support a war of aggression against another country. There are reasons to create internal and external reasons not to do this kind of thing. Those reasons need to be made strong enough that such a war will not be started except in the most extreme circumstances, such as to prevent a Holocaust. If Putin profits from his attack, we can expect other political leaders to look for opportunities to profit from their own acts of aggression. We can expect more people to suffer from the death, injury, disease, famine, and destruction that is inherent in war. If we want to prevent this from happening, our best hope is to commit to the attitude that wars of aggression are wrong and not to be tolerated. This message will protect us, those we care about, everybody, in fact, including and in particular future generations, from suffering the effects of such violence. We have reasons, many, many reasons, to create reasons not to start or support wars of aggression.